So this summer I worked on updating tree ring chronologies of Engelmann spruce in Colorado's Front Range. So I know I'm in a room full of geologists, so I'm going to start out by talking about a little bit of what dendrochronology is. So it's kind of a science that utilizes tree rings to look at changes over time. And it's used for a number of different applications, including one branch of it is called dendroarchaeology, where you look at past items and date them using the available wood on the object, or kind of what I'm focusing on today is called dendroclimatology. So we're looking at changes in precipitation and temperature and how those relate to the growth rings in the trees. And in order to study this, we use an item called an increment borer, which is pictured on the left up here. So we drill this into a tree and extract a core that's about a drinking straw's diameter. So I'm going to define a few terms for you. So a tree ring with chronology is kind of the combined trend of tree ring widths over time for an area. And in order to find that, we have to cross-date our samples. So if we have an older tree ring sample, we can essentially compare our new one to it, as shown in this picture, and we can line up the same rings and see how accurate our measurements were. And when I say tree ring width, just imagine that you cut out the black ring here and measure from the center of the wood to the bark. So why are we doing this? The last time these areas in Colorado have been studied were in the 1980s, where they did make a tree ring chronology. And one of our goals is to update that chronology for further research, and also to explore the effects of temperature and precipitation and how they have affected the growth rates over time. And these things are important because as temperature increases and drought becomes an issue in these forests, they become more susceptible to bark beetle outbreaks. I don't know if you were here for Deanna's talk, but she talked about moving ecosystems. And as temperatures become warmer, the beetles are able to move into different areas that they weren't previously able to access because the trees are dead and they provide a better home for the bugs, essentially. And another risk is forest fires. As the trees dry out, they become more susceptible to burning. And also, it has been shown that with increased temperatures and decreased precipitation, the growing season of the trees is prolonged, but there's not enough water to sustain the growth. So not as much CO2 is absorbed by the trees, and that CO2 is being released into the atmosphere as a result. So the sites I'm looking at are located on Niwot Ridge, very close to CU's Mountain Research Station, and their names are Brainerd Lake 6 and Mountain Research Site 7, which I will call BL6 and MRS 7 for the rest of the talk. So MRS 7 is about 3,000 meters in elevation, characterized by low moisture content, while BL6 is about the same elevation, but it has a moderate amount of moisture. We tried to choose a few different sites. We originally had 3, and the last one was very much a bog site. It had a very high moisture content, but time constraints led us to only use these 2. So the first thing we want to do is core trees that were previously sampled in the 1980s to see if our chronologies match up exactly. So we actually found the same trees. They have tags on them. And then we compare our chronology to the past one to see how well we did. So this is what coring a tree looks like. And when you do this, you want to get to the center of the tree to have all the wood that was present since the beginning of its growth. So you drill about halfway through, insert something called a spoon, take out the core, and then sample it later in the lab. I think that's enough. So after you extract a core, you mount it on a wooden stand, and you essentially just glue it onto a stand and wait for it to dry. And then you have to sand it down on a power sander using a couple different grades of sandpaper. And we do that to expose the rings on the wood, because otherwise it would just be a cylinder. And when we do this, this is what it looks like on the right here. And you can really see the rings. And we do that in order to count them and find the distance between them in order to create that chronology that I was talking about. So this is using a program called Dendro that essentially every green line is a ring, and you have to go click on every single ring there. And this is a terrible figure, but I will explain it to you. The red line is our chronology, and that is we are comparing it to the blue line, which is the older chronology made in the 1980s. And the areas of gray are areas that correspond well. As far as peaks and troughs, the correlation is high. And our chronology corresponded about 80% to the past work, so that's pretty good. And then this is for our second site. It also corresponds pretty well. So this is a standalone tree ring chronology. On the y-axis, we have the width of the tree, and the x-axis, we have changes in time. This is for our second site. I'll explain these a little more later. So the reason we do that is to compare them with changes in temperature and precipitation to see how they have changed. And this graph is a little confusing. So this is data from 1896 through 2013, and the points labeled P are considered the past year. So we essentially offset the data by a year and then compared the two different years. And the reason the full year is not on there is because the months that affect the growing season of the trees are not all of them are important in the growing season. So here we see a negative correlation between temperature and tree ring width, which means as temperature is increasing, the tree ring width of the tree, trees are not growing as fast, essentially, which is, and this is a similar plot of precipitation, and there's largely a negative trend, but the correlation is not high enough to really make any claims about this. And I'm going to take a moment here to talk about where we got our data from and how that affected the results. Our original intent was to use the data from C1 research. At CU's research station, there's a site called C1, which is really on the same road as our plots, and we were going to use that data, but we found that there were a number of holes in the data, so we used a continuous data set called PRISM, which was not technically in the same area, which may account for a low level of correlation in this data. So what conclusions can we draw from this? So our chronologies matched up pretty well with the ones created in the 1980s, which means that they can be used for further research if people need them. As temperature increased, tree ring width and growth was lower, which we expect to contribute to higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, as I mentioned earlier. And the precipitation data was largely inconclusive, which means we can't really comment on that too much. Thank you to everyone on the slide. Here's a picture of Niwot Ridge, where we took our samples. Any questions?
All right, thanks, Garth. Questions? I've actually got two questions for you. I'll try and be quick. Okay. So the first one, I didn't follow how you assigned individual months to the portions of those rings. Is that what I got from one of those figures that you're looking at, June, July, August, deviations from mean growth? Yeah. So how did you?
So the monthly was just the temperature.
Right.
We can't do that with rings because they're annual.
So you're just So you're looking at the annual ring widths versus the temperature for individual months. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, I'll talk to you about that later. That's really cool. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about too is you showed some really interesting plots earlier on about ring width over a long time series.
Right.
I was just wondering if you or any of the people in the group that you're working with, it sure looked like some of those records were sort of quasi-periodic. like there was a pattern there. And I'm just wondering if you guys were talking about, you know, sort of multi-year variations that might be driving tree ring width and growth in those trees. You guys talked about that at all?
As far as individual years, I would say that would have to do with the growing season, but I'm not sure about individual year, interannual trends. Yeah, definitely.
Any other questions? All right. Thanks, Garth.
Thank you.